Next, we will go to the gentlelady from Minnesota, Ms. Omar.
Thank you. Director Young, thank you so much for being with us. Just to piggyback off some of the questions that you were being asked that you didn't really have the chance to fully and clearly answer, does the president's budget proposal add to the deficit?
The president's proposal not only doesn't add to the deficit, his policies would reduce the deficit over 10 years by nearly $3 trillion.
Mm-hmm. And in regards to presidents adding to the deficit, what historical understanding do you have about that?
I've mentioned where I used to sit. I've been in receipt of lots of budgets, and it is not a norm for presidents to send up proposals that pay for their not only spending and investments, but tax cuts.
And would you say that this president has reduced the deficit or increased the deficit in his proposals over the last 2 years?
He presided over a $1.7 trillion deficit reduction in his first 2 years.
And I know that you have continuously repeated the fact that we find ourselves in this predicament, as many other countries find themselves in this predicament because of COVID. What does that tell us about the fiscal health of our country in comparison to other countries who have also dealt with the pandemic?
That tells us we are much more resilient. We are seeing 2 months ago, over 500,000 jobs added. Last month, over 300,000 jobs added. Most economists would not and did not forecast that level of employment growth.
Mm-hmm. And there was a question about what are Americans willing to invest in? I know that in the last 2 years, we reduced child poverty by 40%. We invested in addressing the climate change. But I also know that we've been investing in things like housing, creating affordable housing, and making sure people are able to buy housing. The Minnesota Housing Agency estimates that it would take $2 billion per year to secure the housing of all cost-burdened, low-income Minnesotans. I'm happy that this budget addresses this financial need and recognizes this important truth, that housing is a human right. Our state agency has been using federal and state funds to develop transformative programs to expand and maintain our affordable housing stock. One example is Minnesota's down payment loan program centered on racial and economic equity. The agency hopes to have 40% of first-time homebuyer mortgages go to households of color by 2023, and they actually hit this goal much earlier last year. In my district alone, almost 60% of these loans went to people of color in fiscal year 2022. However, this down payment assistance currently relies on state funds and private-public partnership. Federal and state funds have not kept up with demand. So our state agency has had to make up the difference, which has constrained their budget. Could you explain how the president's budget could help Minnesota narrow the racial wealth gap through affordable housing and mortgage lending programs?
I think a lot of Americans still see home ownership as the path to the American dream. Lots of families' wealth is tied into home ownership. That's why this president feels very strongly that we should do everything we can to encourage that, including increasing more affordable housing supply, which we have proposals to do. We also have a first-time homeowner program. $10 billion in total would help 400,000 people. And I want to be clear who would be eligible for that. Those whose parents do not own a home. So I wouldn't have gotten this, and my child won't get this. This is about putting people on a different path and giving them a leg up, a little breathing room, as the president says. Income below 120% of the area median income and covers their down payment and closing costs. So we think that it's incredibly important to make sure new generations of people who have not experienced home ownership and therefore have not created that wealth through home ownership have a chance.
And so you would say these programs help families that we heard talked about earlier who are overwhelmed with housing costs and the ability to afford a house. It would help families be able to feed their children with this budget proposal, that it would help make sure families have jobs to sustain themselves.
At least 400,000 families with this proposal to start. And it's also critical we look at the proposals that would encourage the building of affordable housing. We know there is a housing stock problem in many parts of this country.
Thank you, and I yield back.